Do you believe that just a $200 steak could completely change the fate of one person and an entire restaurant? The sound of clinking silverware echoed softly in the refined atmosphere of Carter's Prime, where warm golden lights spilled across tables draped in immaculate white linen, arranged with the precision of a high-class gala. But that elegant calm shattered in an instant with the deep, cold voice of a man. $200 for this? Liam Carter's words dropped heavy as stone, causing several diners to glance up in shock, their conversations dying mid-sentence. With a sharp, deliberate motion, he slapped the bill onto the table, the crisp thud cutting through the silence like an accusation. I wouldn't feed this to a stray dog. His face betrayed no hesitation, only the dark gleam of his eyes, sharp as blades, sweeping over the room until a few patrons quickly ducked their heads, pretending to study their plates to avoid meeting his gaze. Across from him, Miles Turner, the lanky waiter dressed in a uniform faded from too many washes, froze mid-motion. His trembling hand reached out as if to take the bill, then stopped midway as though an invisible weight held it down. His wide eyes glistened with helplessness, lips parting to speak, but no sound escaped his throat. Standing before Liam felt less like serving a customer and more like standing trial, awaiting a verdict. The room grew so quiet that the ticking of a distant wall clock was suddenly loud, broken only by the uneven sound of Miles's quickening breaths as he struggled to stop his shaking. Liam leaned forward, one large hand resting on the table, his fingers tightening as though he could crush the very air. Do you take me for a fool? This is supposed to be premium Wagyu, yet it's tough as rubber, bland enough that I'd rather eat grass. And you expect me to pay $200 for this pathetic excuse of a meal? His voice dropped lower, calm but cutting, each word slicing through the air with a precision that made the back of the neck prickle. A few diners at nearby tables shot Miles judgmental glances, as though blaming him for ruining their peaceful evening with this humiliating scene. Miles lowered his head, shoulders curling inward as if trying to disappear. Strands of damp hair clung to his temple, catching the soft yellow light. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and managed to whisper, I sincerely apologize, sir. I can replace your dish right away. But Liam cut him off, his icy gaze shutting down every attempt at an excuse. Be quiet. I don't need hollow apologies. I need quality, and you, or the people behind you, are insulting your customers. His final word lingered, sharp as a thin blade cutting into the fragile pride Miles had left. An invisible chill seemed to sweep across the dining room, silencing both staff and guests. Miles's fingers clenched the serving tray tightly, knuckles turning white as they pressed against its edge. He took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself, but his heart pounded so violently it felt ready to burst. For a brief moment, his eyes caught his reflection in the large glass pane nearby pale face, hollowed eyes. It wasn't just the face of a humiliated waiter. It was the face of a man holding on to his last bit of strength to keep this job, for reasons no one in the room could possibly understand. Liam said nothing more. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his piercing gaze locked on Miles, as if waiting to see what he would do next. All eyes in the restaurant shifted toward table 6, where the tension was so thick it felt suffocating, and everyone silently wondered, how long could the frail waiter stand his ground against a man as relentless as Liam Carter? The door closed softly behind him, and the noise from outside faded into a thick, almost suffocating silence. Liam Carter sat alone in front of the large mirror in the corner of the room, the warm yellow light casting sharp shadows across his angular face, revealing deep lines etched into his forehead, scars of decades of relentless struggle. Slowly, he lifted his hands and removed the ash-gray wig that had covered his head all evening. Strand by strand, it fell onto the dark wooden table like pieces of a discarded mask. Next, he carefully peeled off the adhesive from the scruffy fake beard, exposing the true face of a man hardened by experience, strong yet carrying a fatigue he could no longer hide. His gaze locked onto his own reflection, those dark, piercing eyes staring back at him, not the irritable customer who had terrified the entire restaurant staff tonight, but Liam Carter, the real owner of Carter's Prime. He sat there motionless, letting old memories play out in his mind like a slow-motion film. 20 years ago, he wore a shabby apron, rushing from table to table with trays of food, always keeping his head down to avoid the contemptuous glances of wealthy diners. He had endured being yelled at, humiliated, even having sauce thrown in his face, all because he needed every penny to care for his ailing mother. Those memories never faded. They were so vivid he could almost hear the squeak of his shoes on the wet kitchen floor during rainy days and feel his own ragged breaths as he fought back tears behind the swinging kitchen door. His hand clenched the edge of the table, knuckles turning white as veins bulged beneath his skin. He lowered his eyes, staring at his own hands, hands once calloused from carrying heavy trays, blistered from gripping hot pans for hours. Now they were adorned with expensive suits, gleaming rings, and a Swiss watch. Yet beneath that polished exterior, he knew he was still that struggling waiter who understood every crack in the hearts of those working themselves to the bone just to survive. "Do they still deserve this name?" Liam whispered, his deep, gravelly voice heavy with self-reproach. He raised his eyes back to the mirror, this time with a look of judgment, not reflection. He drew a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his chest still rose and fell with restrained anger. "If what I fear is true tonight, I'll shut this place down. No matter how proud I once was of the name Carter's Prime, I won't let it become a stain." His words hung in the air, cold and absolute, like a verdict delivered to the very legacy he had spent years building. He remained seated for a long moment, unblinking, staring at his reflection. His eyes were dark and determined, no longer those of an angry customer, but of a man at war with his own heart, a man deciding whether to save everything or destroy it, to protect the values he swore never to betray. Finally, Liam stood, his hand pressed firmly on the table, knuckles white again, as if grounding himself in resolve. "All right," he said quietly but firmly. "Let the truth tonight decide the fate of it all." Miles Turner stood by the service counter, his posture slightly hunched as if his entire body was straining under an invisible weight. His once crisp white uniform had yellowed at the collar after countless washes, the sleeves frayed at the edges, revealing thin arms marked with small scratches from brushing against table corners or hot kitchen surfaces. While other staff exchanged quiet laughter when no customers were calling for service, Miles moved diligently from table to table, carefully adjusting each glass, wiping faint water stains with a cloth worn so thin it was nearly transparent. His expression remained calm, but deep in those dark brown eyes lay a crushing exhaustion. A soft vibration buzzed from his pocket. Miles flinched, quickly glancing around as if terrified of being caught, then discreetly pulled his phone from under the counter. The screen lit up with a familiar name. Mom. He answered immediately, his voice low and gentle, as if speaking any louder would shatter the fragile mask he had built. "It's me, Mom. Yes, I'm fine. I'll be home soon. Don't forget to take your medicine. I know, just 2 more months." His tone was soothing, but when he reached the last words, his throat tightened, and he swallowed hard to keep his voice from trembling. After hanging up, Miles stayed still, his hand gripping the phone in his pocket, as if holding on to the only thing keeping him from falling apart. He lowered his head, exhaling softly, then resumed wiping tables. The damp cloth, chilled by the water, stung his calloused fingertips, but he paid no attention. He kept wiping the same spotless spot as if each motion could reassure him. Just 2 more months, only 2 more months. Yet his eyes betrayed him. They could not hide the emptiness. Under the warm, golden lights of the restaurant, his gaze lingered on the polished surface, no longer that of a dedicated worker, but of a man utterly drained, a man working himself to the bone while desperately concealing his greatest fear. If he lost this job, his mother would have no chance at treatment. At table 6, Liam Carter sat silently, his sharp eyes tracing Miles's every move. He watched him like a hawk studying its prey, yet a different glimmer flickered for an instant in his gaze. Liam noticed the sweat sliding down Miles's temple, the way he kept straightening the edges of the cloth even though it was spotless, and the subtle trembling of his shoulders as he pressed the phone to his ear. Nothing escaped Liam's attention, and a fleeting thought crossed his mind. What exactly was this young man trying so hard to endure? Miles had no idea he was being watched. He bent down, resting one hand on the table while wiping, the other unconsciously gripping the edge of the serving tray, his knuckles turning pale as veins bulged beneath the skin. A bead of sweat rolled down his neck, dripping onto the cloth that kept scrubbing the already spotless surface. A heavy silence stretched for a full minute before Miles inhaled deeply, forcing a weary smile as he moved to the next table. But that smile never reached his eyes. Liam tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening for the briefest moment before hardening again, turning cold as steel. He tapped his fingers on the table, each rhythmic knock like the slow beat of a drum foretelling something imminent. And when Miles turned back to serve him again, Liam was ready for the next step in the test he had planned, a test that could change the young man's life forever. Table 6 was wrapped in a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Liam Carter leaned back in his chair, arms loosely crossed as if the entire situation were nothing more than an idle amusement. But his eyes, cold and deep, were locked on Miles Turner's every smallest movement. The test had begun the moment Liam stepped into this restaurant, and now it had reached its peak. "Bring me the most expensive thing your kitchen has," Liam said slowly, each word dropping like a stone into water, making the air around his table instantly heavier. Miles froze for a brief second, his hand holding the notepad, pausing before he nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll bring it out right away." His tone was gentle and polite, but if one looked closely, they could see the corner of his mouth twitch slightly, an involuntary reaction. He turned toward the kitchen, his back straight and his steps deliberately slow to hide the tightness squeezing his chest. 10 minutes later, he returned with a shining silver tray, carrying a carefully plated Wagyu steak. The golden light reflected off the glistening, tender meat, enough to satisfy any diner at first glance. But Liam barely spared it a glance before lifting his eyes, his cold stare piercing straight into Miles. "Put it down," he ordered, his tone steady but carrying an almost imperceptible challenge. Miles placed the tray on the table, his posture still perfect, but his fingertips had turned pale from gripping too tightly. Liam slowly picked up his knife, cut a small piece, and placed it in his mouth, chewing unhurriedly while keeping his eyes fixed on Miles. A few diners at nearby tables began glancing over, some tilting their heads slightly, waiting for what might happen. Then Liam set the knife down on the plate with a sharp clink that rang loudly in the quiet air. He raised an eyebrow, his voice low but icy. "You call this Wagyu? I'd say this belongs on a roadside diner's menu." Miles shifted slightly, ready to apologize, but Liam raised his hand to stop him. "Don't say anything. I don't need empty apologies. I need professionalism, something you and your kitchen clearly don't understand." His words were loud enough for nearby tables to hear, drawing curious and uneasy looks. Liam didn't stop there. He picked up his glass of water, frowning. "And this is the water you serve to customers? Bathwater looks clearer than this." He set the glass down hard enough that water splashed over the rim, his tone sharp enough to slice through any excuse Miles might have given. A brief silence followed before Liam gave another command. "Bring me a new glass of water, immediately." Miles bowed slightly. "Yes, sir." He turned and walked toward the kitchen, his grip on the tray so tight his knuckles stretched white. He didn't protest, didn't argue, just followed orders as if he were used to this kind of humiliation. But the faint tremor in his shoulders betrayed the weight of his exhaustion and pressure. A few minutes later, Miles returned with a new glass of water, placing it down with such precise care it was almost perfect. Liam lifted it, took a sip, and frowned slightly. "Better, but still not enough. Take it away." The words sliced through Miles's patience like a knife, but he maintained his polite smile, nodded, and turned to take the glass back again. The entire restaurant had fallen silent. All eyes followed Miles as he quietly walked back toward the kitchen. At table 6, Liam remained seated, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the table, his sharp gaze dissecting every tiny reaction from Miles. He didn't look satisfied, But deep in his eyes, there was the faintest glimmer of something else, something that looked like anticipation, a quiet expectation, waiting for this test to reveal the true nature of the young waiter standing before him. The air inside the restaurant was so thick it felt suffocating. Even the clinking of cutlery against plates at nearby tables seemed to slow, as if weighed down by the invisible pressure radiating from table 6. Miles Turner walked briskly toward the kitchen with the second glass of water on his tray, his shoulders trembling slightly under the warm, golden light. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple, dripping onto the silver tray and glinting briefly before vanishing, just like hope slowly being worn away. Yet he forced himself to keep that tired smile, the one that had become a habit, a fragile mask shielding him from the prying eyes around him. Near the kitchen doorway, Sophia Lane, Carter's Prime's head chef, leaned against the frame, her sharp gaze locked on the scene unfolding before her. She wiped a gleaming knife with slow, meticulous strokes, her movements almost obsessive. Sophia was not the type to be easily bothered by customers, but ever since Liam Carter had stepped into the restaurant and begun making one harsh demand after another, she had taken notice. Her jaw tightened, her voice low as if speaking only to herself. Something's wrong. That man is not an ordinary customer. Her brown eyes glinted with suspicion, reflecting the shimmer of the knife's blade, as though she were bracing herself for a confrontation. A few steps away, Mason Hale, the restaurant manager, stood with arms crossed, leaning lazily against the wine counter. He cast a quick glance at table 6, his lips curling into a half-smile of indifference, and muttered under his breath, "Not my problem, as long as it doesn't hurt the revenue." Mason had no idea that Sophia heard him. She turned her head toward him, her icy stare making him shiver for an instant, but he pretended not to notice, feigning focus on a stack of receipts in his hand. Miles returned to table 6, placing the new glass of water with painstaking precision, but Liam only stared at him with eyes as cold as ice. "Better," Liam said slowly, then took a sip. But almost immediately he set the glass down hard enough for water to splash over the rim, his voice cutting through the silence. "Still not good enough. I'm not paying for carelessness. Change it again." The words were like a blade slashing through what little patience Miles had left. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something close to defiance. His hands gripped the serving tray so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breathing grew shallow, as if one more word could snap the fragile thread holding him together. But like a soldier too familiar with the battlefield, he drew in a deep breath, swallowed all his anger, lowered his head, and said, "Yes, sir." Sophia watched, her fingers tightening around the knife until the veins stood out on her hand. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes flashing with determination. "If he's really testing him, I won't forgive anyone who just stands by and does nothing." Her voice was barely audible, but it carried a restrained fury. Miles turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long under the warm light, looking so utterly alone that several diners quietly followed him with their eyes. At table 6, Liam sat with arms crossed, his gaze never leaving Miles's retreating figure, unblinking, like a predator studying its prey to the very last second. But deep within those cold, sharp eyes, a fleeting hint of doubt flickered before quickly disappearing. It was going to be a long night, a grueling test, and in this moment no one knew how much longer Miles's endurance would last. But one thing was certain. If it snapped, the consequences would not end with a simple apology or an excuse. The usual soft clinking of cutlery and quiet murmurs in the restaurant seemed to vanish, swallowed whole by a single sound, the thunderous slam of a hand striking the table, echoing like a summer storm at midnight. Liam Carter shot to his feet, his eyes glinting with a cold, unyielding fury. His strong hand hit the polished wooden table with such force that the water glasses nearby trembled. $200 for this garbage? His voice carried just enough to be heard clearly throughout the entire restaurant, each word dropping like a hammer, leaving no room for argument. Miles Turner stood frozen, the serving tray in his hands trembling as his fingers shook uncontrollably. A bead of sweat rolled from his temple down his cheek, landing on the pristine white tablecloth, leaving a small, dark spot, a spot that looked like a permanent stain on his dignity. His face turned pale, and the tired, habitual smile he wore was gone, leaving only a blank expression and eyes that seemed on the verge of breaking. Mason Hale, the restaurant manager, hurried over, his face showing a trace of nervousness, though he tried to maintain a calm exterior. "Sir, if you're unhappy with," he began, but Liam turned sharply toward him, his gaze cutting through Mason's words like a blade. "Stay right there." His voice wasn't loud, but its weight was enough to make Mason stop mid-step. A flicker of anger flashed in Mason's eyes, quickly replaced by hesitation and caution. He stepped back, hands clenched tightly behind his back, attempting to hide his discomfort. Sophia Lane, the head chef, stood at a distance near the kitchen door, her eyes sharp with focus as she observed everything. Her hands tightened around the gleaming knife she had just cleaned, veins standing out along her fingers. Every word from Liam cut into Miles's pride like a blade, and Sophia could see each subtle reaction from the young waiter. His shoulders trembled, but he didn't protest, didn't fight back, only bowed his head in silence. The sight made Sophia's chest tighten, but she didn't step forward, not yet. Liam's eyes were locked on Miles, sharp and predatory, like a hunter watching weakened prey. "I'm not paying a cent for this. If I have to, I'll call the police to inspect your kitchen. I will not tolerate being deceived." Each word was like a verdict, turning the once warm atmosphere of the restaurant into something cold and suffocating. The diners nearby began whispering, some glancing over with curiosity, others shaking their heads subtly. Miles bowed his head even lower, his thin hands gripping the edge of the tray so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He drew in a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. I sincerely apologize, sir. I can." But Liam cut him off before he could finish. "I don't need an apology. I need the truth, and the truth will be made clear right now." Liam stood taller, his voice dropping into a deeper, commanding tone, each word sharp and deliberate. "Bring me the real person in charge here. Or—" He paused, his eyes sweeping across the entire restaurant before stopping on Mason's pale face. "I'll handle this another way." In an instant, the entire room fell silent. No more whispers, no clinking of plates or glasses, only the sound of Miles's quickened breathing and the tense stares of everyone around. Mason hesitated, Sophia's grip on her knife tightened, and Miles stood bowed, looking like a condemned man awaiting judgment. And Liam, his eyes cold and sharp as steel, remained standing at the center, like a storm raging through the room, showing no signs of stopping. The private room door closed with a heavy click, sealing Liam Carter and Miles Turner away from the curious eyes of the diners outside. The air inside felt thick, almost suffocating. Liam sat down, his gaze locked on Miles, who stood with his head bowed, his thin hands gripping the serving tray so tightly that the veins on his knuckles stood out stark white. His whole body trembled as if he were awaiting a final judgment. Liam crossed his arms, his eyes cold as steel. For several seconds he said nothing, simply staring at Miles, letting the silence itself press down on the young man's narrow shoulders like an invisible weight. Then suddenly, Liam leaned forward, his hand slowly reaching up to remove the ash-gray wig still on his head. The motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The wig slid off, revealing his real black hair, and then he peeled away the adhesive from the fake beard. Each movement stripped away another layer of disguise until Liam's real face emerged sharp, firm, and radiating authority. Miles looked up instinctively, and when his eyes met Liam's true face, his entire body seemed to freeze. His eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat as if he had just realized something unbelievable. "Oh my God," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. His knees buckled for a moment, forcing him to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. You are." "That's right," Liam replied, his voice deep and firm, no longer carrying any hint of pretense. "I am Liam Carter, the owner of Carter's Prime, and tonight you have been serving the man who owns this place." He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table, fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm, his eyes never leaving Miles's pale face. Miles trembled, his head lowering even further, his shoulders curling inward as if trying to make himself smaller. I'm sorry. I didn't know. His words were shaky and broken, but Liam raised a hand, stopping him. "Silence. I don't need an apology. I need an answer." His eyes flashed, sharp as steel striking stone. "I watched you all night, and I need to know, why does someone like you, even when humiliated, even when pushed to the breaking point, keep working without fighting back? Why?" Miles stood frozen, his lips parting but no sound coming out. His eyes shimmered under the warm golden light, as if tears were on the verge of spilling. For a moment, Liam saw something else behind those eyes, a pain unrelated to food or wages. Liam tilted his head, his tone softening slightly, though still edged with intensity. "I'm not asking out of curiosity. I'm asking because you just passed the toughest test I've ever given. And your answer will decide whether you continue working in this kitchen tomorrow or become the person I choose to help restore the honor of this place." Miles lifted his head slowly, his eyes glistening, his lips trembling. For a long moment, neither spoke. Liam sat still, waiting in silence, while Miles seemed to battle himself, torn between keeping his secret or speaking the truth. Finally, a heavy breath escaped his dry lips. I have no other choice," he said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow, his shoulders sagging as if he had just dropped a massive burden. "I need the money to save my mother. She's very sick. I can't lose this job. Not now." Liam closed his eyes briefly, taking in a deep breath. When he opened them again, his gaze had changed, no longer sharp and cold, but carrying a strange glint, a mix of respect and something else. He gave a slight nod and spoke slowly. "I understand. And now you will understand why I did all of this." Miles Turner stood motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides, his shoulders still trembling slightly, as if he couldn't believe the words he had just spoken aloud. Liam Carter sat in silence, his gaze fixed on Miles, his expression strangely contemplative. He was no longer the cold, intimidating man who had kept the entire restaurant on edge all evening, but someone quietly evaluating the person standing before him. The silence was so heavy that the sound of Miles's uneven breathing mingled with the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Liam drew in a slow breath, then rose to his feet. His steps were measured, steady, echoing softly against the polished wooden floor as he walked toward Miles. He stopped just inches away, his deep eyes locking onto Miles as if trying to pierce through every wall he had built. "You know, Miles," Liam said slowly, his voice no longer harsh but warmer, calmer, "I used to be you. 20 years ago, I stood in this very position, yelled at, humiliated, but I gritted my teeth and endured, and the only reason I didn't quit was because there was someone I had to protect." Miles lifted his tear-filled eyes, his breathing still uneven. Liam's tone dropped lower, firm and steady, leaving no room for doubt. "Tonight, I had to know if there was still someone in this restaurant who carried that same spirit. And you showed me. You didn't run. You didn't blame anyone. You didn't lash out. You stood your ground for the right reason." He paused for a moment, his gaze unwavering, then spoke clearly, each word deliberate. "Tomorrow, your account will receive $15,000. The words hit like a lightning strike, leaving Miles stunned. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I can't accept that money, sir." His voice shook, filled with fear and confusion. "I was just doing my job." "I don't deserve this." Liam placed a firm, steady hand on Miles's shoulder. His gaze softened, no longer cold and sharp, but filled with a rare trace of empathy. "You don't get to refuse. This is not a gift. This is a reward you've earned because you held on to something many others have lost, your resolve. Miles lowered his head, his shoulders trembling, no longer from fear but from overwhelming emotion. A single tear fell, then another, and soon they streamed freely down his cheeks. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, choked by emotion. "You don't understand. My mother, she—" Liam gently squeezed his shoulder, interrupting him. "I understand. And now you don't need to worry anymore. Use that money to save her." Miles could no longer hold back. Tears fell to the floor as his breathing came in broken gasps. In that moment, the young man who had stayed strong all evening finally allowed himself to break. He dropped to one knee, his hands covering his face, his sobs, raw and unrestrained, filled not with despair, but with release. Liam stood quietly, looking down at Miles without saying another word. Under the warm golden light, his face remained composed, but deep in his eyes, something softened, something he had buried for too long. Because at that moment, Liam Carter was no longer just a boss testing his employee. He was a man who had once been in the same place, staring at a reflection of his younger self. Outside the private room, the atmosphere remained strangely quiet. Mason Hale stood leaning against the wine counter, his eyes fixed on the closed door as if hypnotized. In his hand was a stack of receipts, but the numbers printed on them no longer meant anything. His mind was blank, filled only with the echo of Liam Carter's voice, cold and sharp as a blade. "Do not interfere." Sophia Lane still stood near the kitchen door, her hands gripping the handle of her knife so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She was no longer paying attention to the dishes waiting to be served, only staring at the silhouettes of the two men behind that closed door. Throughout the evening, Sophia had watched, she had suspected, and now she was almost certain that this was no ordinary angry customer causing a scene. Liam Carter, the true owner, was here, witnessing everything happening to his own employee. And she, who had stayed silent for too long, felt a pang of guilt gnawing at her pride. The door opened. Warm golden light spilled from the room, though it did nothing to ease the tension. Liam stepped out first, standing tall, his expression calm but his eyes shining as if he had just seen something far more important than anything on the restaurant's menu. Miles followed, his head lowered, his eyes red, but holding a different kind of light hope. He no longer tried to hide his emotions, his tear-streaked face strangely peaceful. Sophia moved forward before Mason could react. She pulled off her kitchen gloves, clenching them tightly in her hand as she approached Liam. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice low but filled with regret. I'm sorry. I knew something wasn't right before, but I stayed silent. I shouldn't have let things go this far." Her words were slow, heavy, and her eyes turned to Miles, her gaze filled with respect and remorse. Liam paused, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at Sophia. "Do you know what disappoints me most in places like this?" he asked, his voice deep but loud enough for Mason to hear clearly. "It's not the people who make mistakes, but those who choose to stay silent when they see them happen." Mason stiffened, his expression shifting, but eventually he lowered his gaze. A long silence passed before Mason finally spoke, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "You're right. I was wrong. I thought as long as customers paid and the revenue was stable, nothing else mattered, but I forgot why we started doing this in the first place." His tone dropped, and for the first time all evening Mason didn't look at Liam or Miles, but directly at Sophia, who was still gripping her kitchen gloves tightly. Sophia placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, her gaze no longer sharp but understanding. "At least," she said quietly, "you had the courage to admit it. But from now on, it can't just be words." Mason nodded, his face no longer arrogant, replaced by the heavy realization of someone who had been on the wrong side for too long. Liam observed them both, his eyes no longer cold but thoughtful, filled with quiet consideration. He gave a small nod, then turned to Miles, his voice steady and resolute. "You see, Miles? An imperfect person can still change. And I hope that after tonight, no one here will ever have to bow their head and endure what you went through." Miles lifted his head, his eyes still glistening but steadier than before, as if in that moment he understood that every hardship he had endured had not been in vain. The next morning, Carter's Prime was as busy as ever, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The warm golden lights no longer carried the weight of suffocating tension. Instead, there were gentle smiles exchanged between staff and customers. Everything looked the same: the crisp white tablecloths, the crystal glasses sparkling under the lights, but the spirit within the restaurant was different. Miles Turner stood at the center of the dining room, holding a small notebook, his voice calm yet firm. "Remember this: when guests walk through these doors, they expect more than just a good meal. They expect respect. They expect to feel that every dollar they spend is worth how we treat them." In front of him stood 4 new employees, standing in a neat line, nodding attentively. None of them knew that the man training them had been a thin, exhausted waiter just one night ago. But the weariness in Miles's eyes was gone, replaced by a new sense of conviction, the belief that he could change this place for the better. At the bar, Sophia Lane watched him, the corners of her lips lifting into a rare smile. Beside her, Mason Hale stood silently, his eyes following Miles's every move with an unusual depth of thought. Mason was no longer the man who crossed his arms and stood idly by. He was listening, truly listening. He leaned slightly toward Sophia, his voice sincere. "He's better than I expected. Maybe he's exactly the person we need to preserve this place's honor." Sophia didn't answer. Instead, she placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, a gesture that said more than words ever could. At the far end of the room, Liam Carter stood against the wall, quietly observing. He wasn't dressed in his usual refined attire, only a simple shirt with his hands in his pockets, yet his presence still carried the steady confidence of a man who had lived through more than most. His eyes followed Miles as he guided the new staff, and the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. This was no longer the fragile young waiter he had seen the night before. This was a man who had stood strong through a test and was now standing at the heart of this place like a guiding light for others. One of the young new employees hesitated before asking, "Mr. Miles, why do you love this job so much? I mean, there must be nights when it's really hard." Miles paused for a moment, his eyes flicking briefly to Liam in the corner, the man who still watched silently. Their eyes met for just an instant, and Miles gave a small nod, as if reminding himself of the lesson he had learned the night before. He turned back to the young employee, his voice low and steady. "Because if we do this only to earn a living, everything will eventually fall apart. But if we do it for the people sitting out there, if we believe they deserve to be treated with care, then this job has meaning and we can be proud of it." His words drew quiet admiration from the young staff, their eyes shining with respect. Liam gave a small nod, his gaze softening. He pushed himself away from the wall and turned toward the front door. No one noticed the true owner leaving, and he preferred it that way. Stepping outside, Liam paused for a moment, breathing in the fresh morning air. His eyes lifted to the Carter's Prime sign hanging above the entrance, no longer stern but gentler, warmer. "The test has only just begun," Liam murmured, his deep voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking to himself. Then he turned and walked away, his tall figure blending into the bustling morning crowd. Behind him, Carter's Prime glowed brightly, as if confirming that from this day forward, things would never be the same. And in Liam's steady, unhurried steps was a new sense of faith, the belief that this place had finally regained its true soul. In the service business, money may attract customers the first time, but it is how you treat people that keeps them coming back. The lesson from this story is not just for employees, but for anyone who wants to build true value. Remember, respect is the most expensive dish you can ever serve. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like and subscribe to explore more powerful lessons with us. And leave a comment with the words "I understand" if you also believe that determination and kindness are what truly change everything.